Welcome back to AP World History, and now for our last series on Europe in the Middle Ages, we're going to look at the European conflicts that arise. Primarily, these are going to be religious conflicts, but there are going to be um, more conflicts between European states and also just a very, very bad incident through disease. So, first off, there are the Vikings, which come down from Scandinavia, and they come and raid the coasts of Europe. They attack the monasteries, they attack weak, unguarded cities or poorly guarded cities. But also a positive is they settle and they'll set up trade routes. And because of how great their longships are, they're able to improve trade, especially in the north, but also throughout the rest of Europe. And the reason why the Scandinavians do this, or the Vikings do this, is because Scandinavia is becoming overpopulated. And so they gotta send people away. And so they'll send them to continental Europe and to Britain and Ireland, but they'll also go on journeys and go explore Iceland and settle Iceland, and they'll go to Greenland and settle Greenland, which they'll eventually die out on Greenland. Uh, and then from Greenland, they also reach Newfoundland, which is in Canada, modern day Canada. So they were some of the first Europeans to actually discover the Americas, although we give Christopher Columbus credit in 1492. So Vikings invasions come in and raid. The other major issue from invasions from beyond are the Muslim invasions and incursions, which are fought between uh, the Christians on the western half of Europe and also on the eastern half of Europe. In the west, they had to fight the Spanish Moors, which were trying to come in and take over France. And the Christians, luckily for them, win at the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Tours in France, when they're led by a guy named Charles Martel or Charles the Hammer. And that stops the Muslim advance into Europe. And then in the east, with the fall of the Byzantines in 1453, the Muslims are always, the Ottoman Turks are always a threat to Central Europe. But they really only ever successfully conquer the Balkans and recreate the Byzantine Empire that had fallen apart. They never really get far into mainland Europe because the Europeans are able to unite and take on that common enemy. Now, the one major conflict that the Europeans go out and go try to knock some people down in, or knock some people out in, is the Crusades. There are many, many Crusades, but there are three famous ones that we'll look at, or four famous ones that we'll look at. Uh, and the whole goal of all these Crusades are to reclaim Holy Land for the Christians, or some of the other ones that don't go to the Holy Land, just reclaim land for the Christians, whether it's beating up pagans or knocking out the Muslims. And so you have the First Crusade. This crusade is successful. Uh, the Christians set up small kingdoms in Israel, and the most prominent one being Jerusalem. And they will hold it for several decades, but those will eventually fall to a guy named Saladin. And then we'll have a second crusade where the Christians try to go and retake those lands. They never successfully do anything. Um, they don't retake anything. They kind of bumble and stumble their way along to the Middle East. Then you have Richard the First and Saladin in the Third Crusade, where Richard really tries to knock Saladin out and regain the Holy Land. However, Saladin is an excellent and superb general and thwarts uh, Richard the First's the any attempt that he makes, and so Richard the First eventually packs his bag and goes back to England, but on the way he gets imprisoned and doesn't really get back to England anytime soon after that. And so this is where we get the tales of evil King John and Robin Hood started this time period of the Third Crusade. Then in the Fourth Crusade, Christians are supposed to go to the Holy Land again. Instead, they make a detour in Constantinople and sack Constantinople, which leads to its downfall. And then the last major crusade to make major note of is the Reconquista of Spain, which happens over tens and hundreds of years. Uh, but the Christians slowly regain ground there in Spain and will eventually push all of the uh, Muslims and Jews out in 1492. Now, some major effects on this are some of the weapons and technologies are brought back from the Middle East, like we slowly get gunpowder and paper making and the printing press, but we also get some new ideas, or we're reintroduced to some ideas like the Greek philosophers. They come back to Europe after they had been kind of pushed away by the Roman Catholic Church and they follow the Western Roman Empire and so they're brought back, and these get mixed in with Christianity and will eventually lead to the Renaissance coming about in the late 1200s and through the 1500s. And so here on this map you can see the Crusades. The first one's in purple, that's a successful one. Um, the second one's in green, not as successful. They try, but they aren't able to fully conquer any of those areas. Third Crusade is a good attempt. It actually brings in other people more than just Richard the Lionheart with the King of France and the King of Germany. But France drops out, and the German king or the Holy Roman Emperor king drowns in a stream when he's knocked from his horse. And so these are the last of the, or these are the major crusades. There are many others, but these are kind of the main ones you should know here. And then the other major war that goes on during this time is the Hundred Years' War, and this is a war between France and England in order to control the French kingdoms. And it's a war that doesn't really actually last for a full 100 years. It goes on and off in 10, 15, 20-year cycles. Um, but England looks like they're going to lose from the start, and then they have some great victories at Cressy and Agincourt, and they make a comeback and they start to push actually the French back very heavily, and will eventually almost have most of France. However, a lady comes up named Joan of Arc, will step up for the French and lead the French army into battle and inspire the troops to fight hard. And although she'll get captured by the British and burnt at the stake, uh, the French will reunite all of France and solidify the French king as the true king. And some major effects of this are one, the English longbow becomes known as a major weapon. However, that will be short lived because uh, firearms are shortly coming about. Uh, But the bigger thing is cannons are used successfully for the first time and really have to force the Europeans to redesign their forts and walls on cities. We also get this idea of nationalism starting to come up about how great someone's country is. That starts to build up during this time. And the kingdoms start to build their own professional armies instead of relying on volunteer armies. So that makes warfare much easier, much better, much more efficient, and less expensive than fighting a conventional warfare at the time of using nobles mainly as your fighting force. And the last major thing we'll take a look at here is the Black Death. The Black Death is the bubonic plague that comes into Europe, and it comes and knocks out about 60% of the population. As you can see in the chart there, how drastically it drops off from before the plague to after the plague, with some areas losing huge, huge amounts. Some cities in Italy will lose close to 90% of their population. Um, so um, it does a lot of damage, and it comes in waves. It doesn't just happen all at once or spread slowly. It comes in waves and pushes and pushes and pushes to the edges of Europe. But you'll notice it gets tougher as the farther north you go because the climate's colder and it's not as good for fleas and rats to live and spread the disease.